Dan, how are you?
Hey, good, Charles. Nice to meet you.
So I want to ask you because, I mean, it's kind of the obvious question for the title. Since it's called 18 and a half, I know it refers to the actual minutes that were cut from the tape, but I'm wondering if 18 and a half is sort of a nod to 8.5. Is this a Fellini tip of the hat that you're doing right here?
Well, it's I mean, a little bit of one, but it's and there is there's a couple little similarities in that they both take place at seaside hotels
Yeah.
and resorts. But and also Jules Pfeiffer, who wrote
Mhm.
Bernard and Huey, he was friends with Fellini, so he would
Mm.
talk about Fellini a little bit when I was working with Pfeiffer. But otherwise, no, it almost betrays my roots as more being political than film. Because when someone tells me 18 and a half, I immediately think, oh, the Watergate gap. My mind didn't go to Fellini or barely legal. I mean, there's other connotations for that 18 and a half can have. But for me, having worked in DC for a while and majored in history and political science, 18 and a half just immediately is like, oh, the Watergate tape,
Mm.
where is it, who did it, the mystery behind it. And that to this day nobody knows what was on it, why it was deleted, why that one tape was deleted and nothing else was deleted. And so those mysteries have kind of stuck with me ever since I first learned about them
Yeah, let me
as
use
a
that as
kid.
a bit. I want to jump off that a little bit because
Sure.
you were alive for the Watergate, for the scandals, for the tapes. But looking back, I wouldn't think you were quite sort of the age that would be aware of it until maybe afterwards.
Yeah.
The full extent of what's happening, and
Right.
certainly in your film, the coda that you have, it continues on. This is a real unfinished story. It seems to
Hmm.
be an interest of yours, as sort of unfinished works.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you think that the interest in Nixon and the tapes and Watergate is particularly focused on that, or if it's maybe that the recurring themes. There's so many sort of Nixon themed shows and movies right
Yeah.
now. The idea of truth, the idea of the freedom of the press.
Hmm.
Do you think that this is a story that's of its time, or do you think it's maybe of this time as well too?
Well, that's the nice thing about doing a period film of any kind, is that you can put these thematic things in there that are going to be relevant and also resonate, throughout history, especially when you're making an independent film. You don't know when the film's going to come out, how long it's going to take to make it. So you don't want to be too on the nose specifically about what's happening now. But, I mean, this whole process got started because kind of the spark of it was the 2016 presidential election, and then talking to Pfeiffer literally the next day about comparisons between Nixon and Trump, and oh, we survived Watergate, what could possibly happen in the next 4 years. And then that night I stayed at the Silver Sands Motel, with which my friend Terry owns, and it was built in the 50s and 60s by his grandparents and had been used for fashion shoots, but no one had ever shot a feature. And he said, hey, if we come up with something, you can shoot a feature here. And we kind of had Watergate on the mind because we were just talking about Nixon, and again, that thematic resonance of what was it about Nixon and Watergate that still carries with us 50 years later. And this is the 50th anniversary of the Watergate break-in. And I think part of it was that it was a real turning point in American culture and politics, but because that was kind of the death knell of our trust in authority. If you couldn't trust the president and the presidency, who could you trust? And it kind of and it was a returning point after the 60s and the beginning of the 70s. So I think that's why it was such a scandal. That's why we talk about Nixon. We don't talk about Harding and the Teapot Dome scandal. But and because it applies to so many people around the world too. When we showed this film at the Sao Paulo International Film Festival, people are like, oh, this is really about Bolsonaro. Or
Yeah.
in Manchester, England, where we showed it, they're like, oh, this is kind of like the Boris Johnson situation and his scandal, these bumbling scandals that bring people down. So I think that's nice about using a historical reference, is people not just in our own country but around the world can kind of read into it whatever they want and however they want to approach it.
Tell me about your style a bit as a director. When you're making a 70s set movie, are you trying to film it in a 70s style. You know, the long shots in particular, you don't see a lot of those in films anymore. To be able to hold the scene is so fascinating, the way that you do it. So,
Thank
you
you.
know, what inspires you when you're making a movie like that?
Yeah. I mean, I had, even for Bernard and Huey, I had watched a lot of 60s and 70s films to get ready for that shoot. And then I teamed up with a great cinematographer on this one, Elle Schneider. And she also has a fascination with films of that era. But kind of my mandate, as you said, was to everyone in on the film, from actors, writers, editors, musicians, was we are only going to use creative techniques that could have been done in 1974. And by kind of laying down that mantra for all the departments, that really helped us kind of define that period look and feel. So it's using vintage lenses. It's not using drones, not using even Steadicams, which were invented in 76. On the editing, it's straight cuts. It's on the music, it's only instruments that were around in the 60s and 70s. And the costumes, we had a great costume designer, Sarah Kogan, who had real vintage patterns that she could then make new original costumes with. And the great production designer, Monica Dabrowski, worked with a lot of the things that were at the Silver Sands. I mean, starting with that location kind of got us in the mood, and also because we were all staying there too, and the rooms are very vintage, so you kind of get in this weird mentality of working in that era.
Mm-hmm. So you seem to have a way with the performers you're working with. I don't know if
Thank
this
you.
is the limitations of independent film, or but it just seems like you have people that are in your movies that they're on the cusp. They're on sort of the verge of breaking out. You're looking for good talent. David Harbour before Stranger Things, and
Right,
Jessica Francis Dukes before Ozark, and certainly with Willa, her show Reacher has come out since then, but when you're making the movie, it hadn't yet. And she's wonderful in the movie, and she feels again like someone who's sort of on the verge. She's going to be a huge breakout star. So what is it about her in particular and the cast you're using that you feel like, how did they integrate so well into your vision?
That's a great question. And honestly, part of it is luck, but I get recommendations from other directors. Willa was recommended by Lucky McKee, who's an old friend. John Magaro was recommended by Kelly Reichardt after doing First Cow. And it's like, well, if Kelly recommends him, that's important to me. But also their agents, I have good relationships with a lot of talent agents, and they recommend these people. I mean, that's how we first found Willa, was through her agent. That's how we got Vondy Curtis Hall, was through his. But part is also I try to cast out of New York primarily, or at least firstly, even when we're not shooting in New York, because the New York agents and the New York actors, they tend to be a little bit more serious about what they want to do. And so, they're all theater trained. They've all done a lot of Broadway, off Broadway, that kind of thing. And so they're looking for a higher caliber of material, and that just elevates everyone's game. And so I think that may have something to do with it. Like that literally is my MO. I always start casting out of New York first, and especially in this case because we were shooting there. So we kind of had to go with New York actors, especially because it was kind of the beginnings of the pandemic. It was logistically going to be hard to get LA people.
Yeah, and how do you feel doing a movie like this, subbing in New York for? You're not going to be doing it in and around Washington, but
well, that was the interesting challenge, just story-wise, was we found this great location, but it's on the tip of Long Island. How do you do a Watergate film in Long Island? So one of the first concessions was we said, okay, it's not in Long Island. It's on, we're going to call it St. Michael's in Maryland, which is at least on the Chesapeake. It's close to DC. A lot of people in DC, go out to Rehoboth. And so we had them meet there. And it kind of made sense with why a reporter would want to meet in an out of the way place for a leak of this kind of thing. But that took a little bit of, twisting to make that work. But also indie films, in general, we don't have the budget for hundreds of extras and, a million old period cars. So we needed to come up with a story that would work in a self-contained way. And then as it turned out, that also helped us make it through the pandemic too. But it's really kind of an old thing with indie film is keep it kind of small and sparse and make the most of it.
Mm-hmm. What is your work with Slamdance? How does that affect you? You're probably watching a lot of movies.
Yeah.
You have a lot of you're in this movie too as a voice. You have a lot of cameos, a lot of people, directors, people that doing voices or just popping in. How does that work that you do integrate with your work as a filmmaker?
Well, it's great. I mean, doing Slamdance for 28 years, and I'm not that super involved with it on a day-to-day basis anymore, but I certainly go every year and participate in it, and I host the Hot Tub Summit every year. But I mean, it meant seeing films like The Vast of Night a couple of years ago, and which is a great film that Andrew Patterson directed, and it's also a period film that has a lot of reel-to-reel tapes in it. So I was like, hey Andrew, where do you get the reel-to-reel players? He's okay. This is where you get them. This is how you do it. How do you work with the actors to train them to do it? And talking to him and his actors about that was really helpful, and just knowing other directors over the years to recommend actors, that's a big part of it. So on Bernard and Huey, like to be able to call Joe Russo on the set of Endgame and just say, hey, Joe, how's Jim Rash to work with? And he's like, oh, he's great. You should cast him. And I did, so it's those kinds of connections among other filmmakers that really, that's kind of, or even meeting Elle Schneider. I met her at Slamdance. I met her in Park City. That's how I meet a lot of my collaborators is there. So it definitely helps influence, how and what I make and who I make them with.
And jumping off from your last movie, do you have a feeling that the theme of sort of the unfinished runs through with your work? Like that was like an unfinished film. This movie has a lot of answers, but at the same time, you're not necessarily trying to answer the question of what's on the tapes. It's just providing maybe what could have happened, and you're also sort of, digging into, Wonder Bread, for example. It was Wonder Bread involved in it. Do you think that you just have that kind of maybe curious mind that you're so interested in what is unfinished?
That's a good thematic through line. Yeah, I think so. I majored in history and political science. And so I like digging, I like doing research, and I have a journalism background. So I like doing research into real things, real eras, real time periods. The Wonder Bread thing, that was true. ITT owned Wonder Bread in the early 70s, which I don't think contemporaneously people knew or made a thing about, but we look back at it now and you're like, oh my God, that's hysterical. We can really play with that. And ITT really did have this big scandal with Nixon, which was poised to be a bigger scandal than Watergate actually at the time, until Watergate became a bigger scandal. But I think also the unfinished or not, I think leaving, and I think this is a nice thing about independent film in general is you want to leave room to ask more questions. Then you don't want to button everything up, entirely. It's more interesting. It gets audiences talking and thinking about it. I just got a text yesterday from someone who saw the film a month ago at a festival, and she's like still asking me questions about the characters and about the ending, and she's like, oh my God, I'm still thinking about this film a month later. And I was like, that's great, because hey, if it gets people to watch it more than once, even better.
What about the scenes with the hippies? I couldn't really figure out what was going on at the time. You managed to bring that together at the end, and I'm thinking, oh, okay, maybe there is something there going on.
All right, so maybe I do tie things together at the end, but
well, are you leaving clues? Do you think it's part of that sort of unfinished nature that you're leaving your movies all open for the audience to figure it out? But do you feel like you're maybe consciously leaving some clues in your film?
Yeah, no, definitely. Daniel Moya and I, who's my screenwriting and producing partner, we worked on the script for a long time, and a lot of it was putting clues back in, and laying the breadcrumbs, bread. It's all about the breadcrumbs, for people to come back. And again, I think that makes it nicer for people to then rewatch the movie, knowing kind of how things are going to end, and go, oh, there really is hints to this, that, and the other thing, and clues. So yeah, we were very conscious of putting in clues, because it is a mystery at the end of the day, and the audience and solves it along with the characters.
Hmm. So you alluded a little bit at the beginning, filming this during a pandemic, I imagine presents its challenges. I'm interested right now at this time because of, how your film is coming out, how people are reacting to it. You did the festival run too. We're seeing again that rebirth maybe of cinema or of how people approach movies. Where do you think we stand right now? What do you think is the best way to approach a movie like this?
Well, I think there's been so much emphasis over the last couple of years, especially with the pandemic, kind of heightened by the pandemic, towards episodic series on streamers, on the big streamers. And so narratives have been kind of stretched into these 8-part episodes. And I think that there's already starting to be a little bit of resentment and backlash towards that, where people want a 90-minute film, a movie that they can have a shared experience. If they can safely go to theaters, they want that. People want to go back to theaters. And the nice thing about this one is hopefully people think it's a comedy, and you hear people laughing next to you, that you don't get that on your couch watching Netflix. I think there's also been a little bit of fuzziness and overlap in a good way between festivals and what they can and have been delivering, and the theatrical art house experience, as far as, art houses are doing more Q&As and session, because you can do them on Zoom or live with directors and filmmakers. And likewise, a lot more festivals are doing year-round programming and also paying screening fees in a way that they weren't doing before the pandemic. So I think festivalization of the theatrical experience is something that we're going to see more of, because honestly, it's the one thing that theaters can do in a way that you can't do with streaming channels. You don't, streamers, I mean, they could do it, but they don't have Q&As after them. They don't have that kind of back and forth engagement between the filmmaker and the audience that you can do in a theater, and really only in a theater.
What has been your experience like? Have you been sort of sticking with the episodic television? What have you been diving into lately?
I've been diving into old TV series. And I'll watch old episodes of Combat and 12 O'Clock High from the 60s. And I think the interesting thing about those is, like Law and Order, they're procedurals in one sense. They didn't, TV series back then didn't have big arcs. You could watch a movie and go to bed, or watch a TV show, they were real true episodics. And you didn't have to know what happened in that first season that was only on 3 years ago. And like, what, I don't remember what happened to this character and that character, what's going to happen tomorrow. When I binge it tomorrow, it's like, so I think people are going to go back to that, even on the TV side, even on the streaming side. I think there's going to be a little bit more like, what, maybe we should, they're called episodics for a reason. They should just be episodes, not 6-hour movies that probably should have been, were stretched from an original, 90-minute feature, which I think a lot of these episodic limited, quote unquote, limited series is probably started as features, and then they just get stretched because that's the business model. So the agents are forcing that on everyone.
So I want to ask you, since you talked about the importance of the director Q&A and the feedback and having the feedback from the audience, that seems to be something that you really feed on. What is something from this movie that has surprised you in terms of that reaction, or in terms of the Q&As? What have been some of the questions that have come up that have really fascinated?
Well, I think the biggest surprise, because we couldn't do test screenings with it like you normally would with a film, so I could only show it to one person at a time. And so when we started to show it at the our world premiere was at the Woodstock Film Festival with a big audience, was the laughter. I didn't realize this film was as funny as it was. I always thought of it as a dark comedy, but it's kind of a comedy, people laughing. That was a big surprise, but it's also been interesting, like running into people at different audiences who have their own connections to Watergate. We were at the Anchorage Film Festival, and a guy was there, and he's like, "Oh, my brother was a staff counsel on the Watergate committee." And it's like, oh my gosh, wow. Or somebody says, "Oh, we were just at the Phoenix Film Festival. And it's like, oh, G. Gordon Liddy's son is my next door neighbor. Like, oh my gosh, So I think that's been interesting, is meeting people that have their own backstory to Watergate and their own connections to the story or similar stories like it.
Okay, I want to ask you lastly, what's on the tapes?
What's on the tapes?
What's on the tapes? In your opinion, what's on is it something where it was just the secret with the stretch, where she was doing the stretch?
Yeah.
Or is that all made? Is there something actually on there? Or is it nothing at all? What do you think is on?
Yeah, I've listened to The Gap. Actually, the Nixon library, you can listen to The Gap and you hear the clicks and pauses. It's not just a continuous 18.5 minutes. That was the interesting thing, is when forensic analysis, you don't even have to be an analyst. You can hear it. Like someone literally is pushing start, stop, start, stop. Because you can hear that. So it was clearly an intentional thing that wasn't done by Rosemary Wood in the way, with her stretch. And people didn't believe that even at the time. Like as soon as she did that, everyone's like, no way. She's just, sticking, she's just a loyalist for Nixon. So, but to this day, nobody really knows what's on it. It's, you can tell, from the contemporaneous notes that Haldeman took during that 2-hour session, that they were talking about Watergate during that 18.5 minutes, but it's still a mystery why that, of all the tapes, that was the one that was deleted. Now, one interesting discovery we made that I don't think has ever been made by anyone is that, we listened to the rest of the tape, because that 2 hours, because we wanted to kind of feel the flavor of the room, because they're talking about completely unrelated to Watergate things, and nobody ever listens to it. But about 2 minutes later, and you hear this, our version of it in our end credits, Nixon and Haldeman are talking about The Hot Rock, this Robert Redford movie that had just come out. And they're laughing about it because they're like, oh yeah, that's this heist film all gone wrong. The guys got stuck in the box. Yeah, they kind of like this Watergate thing. And so even they realized 3 days after the burglary that Watergate was a farce, that the whole thing was just like a bad comedy, and Nixon actually asked he tells Haldeman, hey, let's get that movie to watch with Pat this weekend. And they did. We looked and checked the records and they watched that movie. And of course, the irony is 3 years later, Redford is playing, he's in All the President's Men playing Bob Woodward. So, but yeah, so we came up with kind of our best guess of what might be on the tape, based on a lot of research that we did and plausible explanations of what could be on there, but nobody will ever really know.
What's great is it all comes back to film. They're talking about movies. They're inspired by it. So that's really good.
Exactly. It's bizarre. And then of course, 30 years later, Redford would call me and my friends parasites for starting Slamdance. So
yeah, that's right. Because
sort of our own connection.
Yeah, there it is. And still unfinished as well, too. Exactly. Dan, I've never had a chance to actually talk to you in a sort of formal setting like this, more informally, but I just wanted to say how much I appreciate it. I really enjoyed
Thanks.
Hearing from you.
No, thank you. And if you have any other questions, just let us know.